For the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at scriptures through the lens of a boat. First, the boat that Noah and his family were on, and then the boat that Jesus and his disciples took across Lake Galilee. And of course, we, the church, are in a boat too. You may recall the shape of the roof, and when we were in church, we looked up and saw the layout of the nave, and it resembles the underside of a boat. And church architecture is designed to remind us that we are called to journey through the waves of this life together. So that's the symbolism. And just a quick plug, if you want to catch any previous messages about this, our sermons are uploaded weekly onto our church YouTube page. Today, I thought we could conclude our nautical-themed exploration by joining the disciples in another boat, this time in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. And this story differs from the last week's account because Jesus is not with them in the boat. Last week, Jesus was a fellow passenger sleeping under deck. This week, the disciples are on their own. So let's see how things unfold.
Jesus walked on the water. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking towards them on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed a strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God."
No doubt this passage is a familiar one for many of us. It has inspired countless numbers of Christian books on faith, with this idea that if you want to accomplish great things for God, then you simply need to step out the boat in faith. It's all very compelling and it's not difficult to see why. Be like Peter, walk on water, do great things, okay? Well, today I want us to question whether this is actually what the passage is talking about. I want us to really dig deep into the text because I think there may be a few surprises in there that might suggest otherwise. And to do that, we first need to understand a bit of a context. So just before our passage begins, Jesus has received the terrible news that John the Baptist has been beheaded by Herod. And so upset, he goes off to spend some time alone. But we read that the crowds follow him and they find him. And when Jesus sees them, he has compassion and then he heals their sick. Then at the end of the day, because they were in a remote place, he performs the miracle of feeding the 5,000. And that's all contained, all of that's done in chapter 14. And then we get to our passage right at the end of it, and it says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountains by himself to pray." So Jesus has just had an exhausting day emotionally and physically. He's heard of the death of his cousin, John the Baptist. He spent the day healing the sick. Then he performs a huge miracle to feed the 5,000. And after all of that, he goes off by himself to be with God. And what a lesson we can learn here from Jesus' example. Because for lots of us individually and as a church, at St. John's, the past few years have been exhausting. For some, the natural response is to turn to God, as Jesus did, to find comfort in his presence. But for others, and myself included, our natural inclination might be to rush around and try to fix things, or go into panic mode and freeze and not do anything at all. These are natural responses. But if we can just try to make space in our busy days for God, try to make times of quiet where we can be just with him, we'll be following the example of Jesus. I just want to make that quick point. Okay, but let's continue. Jesus goes up the mountain to pray while the disciples head off in a boat. And while they're at sea, we read that a storm breaks out. And the first thing I want to emphasize is this. Jesus specifically tells the disciples to go out in the boat. Why is this important? Well, there are times in the Bible where bad things happen to people because they're not following God's commands. But this is not one of those occasions. Here the disciples are doing exactly as God had told them to, but they still find themselves in the middle of a storm. And sometimes we can be living lives in a way that Jesus has called us to, and yet all of a sudden things begin to go very wrong. Problems crop up in our home or our work lives. Relationships begin to fall apart. We or someone we care about becomes very ill. Bad things happen to good people. But please hear me. This doesn't mean we're not doing things right. It doesn't mean we're not praying enough. It doesn't mean God doesn't love us. And it doesn't mean he is punishing us. Please, please be assured, if this is you, whatever it is you're going through or what's happening in your life, however difficult things are, God is not punishing you. And he definitely hasn't stopped loving you. In fact, and we'll read this, he is watching over you the whole time. You see, the disciples were Jesus' best friends. He loved them dearly, and yet even when they were doing exactly as he had told them, they still found themselves in a storm and lost out at sea. Now, if you've ever been to or seen a picture of Lake Galilee, you'll see that it is surrounded by hills and mountains that overlook it. The disciples were in a boat on the lake, and they wouldn't have been able to see Jesus up on his mountain. But here's the thing. Jesus would have been able to see them. From his mountaintop position, Jesus would have been able to see the boat in the storm. And so when we lose sight of Jesus because of what's going on around us, he still has eyes on us. Jesus is watching over us at all times. And maybe that's a word for someone listening today who's going through rough times. Be encouraged. Okay. The storm blows up, the boat is far from land, and the wind is against them. And just as things look like they can't get any worse, we read that Jesus comes walking towards them across the lake. So what the disciples saw was a figure approaching them through the storm on the water. And not surprisingly, we read that they were terrified. And at the time, there was a myth going around that when people drowned at sea, they haunted the waters, and they would appear like in the air, and torment people out on their boats. And the disciples probably thought that this was what they were seeing, which might explain why they cried out in fear, "It's a ghost." And so Jesus immediately reassures them that it was him and tells them not to be afraid. Now, here's the really interesting part of the story about which much has been written, walking on water. The two questions that usually get asked here are, did Peter have loads of faith because he walked on water? Or, number two, did Peter have little faith because he sank? All right. Well, let's take a look at the conversation that went on just before Peter did this faithful or doubtful thing, okay? Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." The important thing to notice here is that Jesus didn't tell Peter to walk on the water. What he actually said was, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Okay, he's speaking to Peter in the boat. Jesus had told his disciples to head out in the boat already, we've discussed that, and now he's telling them not to be afraid. He does not command any of them to get out of the boat. So how on earth did Peter come up with this idea of walking on water himself? Was he trying to test Jesus? Because he did say, "If it's you," not "I know it's you." So maybe Peter was checking that it was Jesus and perhaps not the ghost they might have thought it was. Perhaps. We also know that Peter was a speak first, think later kind of chap. Several times in the Gospels, Peter acts or speaks without thinking. So is this just another one of those occasions where he acts rashly? "Oh wow, Jesus, you're walking on water, say the word and I'll do it too," and he does it. Whatever the reason, and it could have been either, Peter convinces himself that he should walk on water too. Okay, so he says it. Now Jesus hears what Peter says, and he does say, come. He says, come, but remember, Jesus didn't suggest this in the first place. It wasn't his idea. And yet Peter clearly wants to walk on the water, and so Jesus lets him. Jesus knew Peter. He knew what he was like. He knew it wasn't going to end well. But he said, come. How often do we make mistakes? How often do we test or bargain with God, or make huge promises that God knows we won't keep? Or how often do we come up with an incredible idea, we're going to step out in faith and do this crazy thing, and then try to make it God's? Just say the word and I'll go to Antarctica and be a missionary, right? God knows us as well as Jesus knew Peter, and thankfully God doesn't always give us what we ask for, but in Peter's case, he did, well, at least for a few moments. Because we read, Peter gets out of the boat and begins walking towards Jesus on the water. This over-enthusiastic disciple, Peter, walked on water, and that is incredible. That's awesome. But then we read that he saw the wind, he was afraid, he begins to sink and cries out to Jesus, Lord, save me. Peter had started out doing what Jesus had told him and the disciples to do, right? To go ahead of him in a boat, that's fine. But then somewhere along the way, Peter decides to write his own script. He tries to run before he can walk. All the disciples had to do was wait in the boat until Jesus got there. And remember, we read he was actually on his way and they'd seen him. But this wasn't enough for Peter. Peter wanted to do his own thing. He wanted to walk on the water and he couldn't wait. But after realizing what he'd done, when he sees the wind all around him, he panics and he sinks. Now, it's often said that he sank because he took his eyes off Jesus. And maybe that's true. And that's why all these popular Christian books focus on and build a theology of faith, around this. Or maybe Peter sank, I don't know, because people aren't designed to walk on water. Jesus did it, but that's because Jesus is God. Jesus created water, and it says in Hebrews, all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, through him. If Jesus wants to walk on water, that's up to him. But Peter? Interesting. It's not unknown for people to get carried away with what they think God has told them to do and then get themselves in a right pickle. You only have to flick through the pages of history to see some pretty tragic examples of this, people who do things in God's name. And if we're honest, sometimes we can misread God's plans or convince ourselves they're God's plans. Or even if it is his plan, we can rush on ahead before the time is right because it seems like a good idea. And then, like Peter, we can find ourselves out of our depth or confused and frustrated because what we thought was going to happen hasn't happened. It's always a good idea to wait for God and not to rush ahead. Even Jesus practiced this. He spent so much time on his own with God, making sure he was doing everything in accordance with his Father's will and timing. And even in today's reading, the disciples were out in a storm, but Jesus waited until he'd spent time with God before he went to them. He didn't just rush off to save them. So what happens next? Well, Peter realizes he's in trouble and he calls out for help. And it says, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Jesus may have left them in the storm for hours, but as soon as Peter was going to drown, Jesus was right there with him. Jesus loved Peter and he had great things for him to do. Because we know later that once Jesus was gone, Peter was eventually going to lead his church and Jesus wasn't going to let him drown before his time, even if he was an impulsive individual. Jesus grabs Peter and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Another question for us to consider. What actually had Peter doubted? Again, many have said that the doubt Peter had was about sinking, that if only he had kept his eyes on Jesus, if only he had had enough faith, he would have continued to walk on water and everything would have been fine. Okay, that's one view and often the most popular. But again, I want to suggest something different. Perhaps the doubt Jesus is referring to is Peter's decision not to trust him enough to stay in the boat. Remember, Jesus had originally told his disciples to get in the boat in the first place, and the author is very deliberate in including the detail at the start. Then, when a storm blows in and they can't see Jesus, he keeps his eyes on them whilst they're still in the boat. It was a frightening experience, but Jesus knew they were ultimately safe, and he takes his time getting to them whilst they are, again, in the boat. And when the disciples see him and are terrified, thinking he's a ghost, he reassures them and tells them not to be afraid in the boat. But instead of staying in the boat with the other disciples and trusting Jesus, Peter decides he wants to walk on water to meet him. But the thing is, Jesus was already on his way. It says he was already coming. There was no need for Peter to get out of the boat. And sometimes we just need to have the faith to wait for Jesus. That's why I think Jesus says to Peter, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" In other words, why didn't you wait for me? And let's read on, because we're almost coming to the end. It says, "When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat," notice it says those in the boat, "worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" When Jesus' followers are all together in the boat, again, they worshipped him. And this picture of worshipping is very important. You see, Jesus didn't want Peter to be a lone Christian. He took him back, pulled him back even into the boat. He didn't say, "Oh, well done, Peter, let's go off just the two of us and have a walking on water party." He said, "Why did you doubt?" And he pulls him back into the boat, where with the other disciples, he worships Jesus. Jesus loved Peter and he wanted him to be part of his church. He didn't want him off on his own, breaking off to form, another group. He wanted him to be with the rest of the disciples. The author is very deliberate in bookending the passage of scripture with Jesus first commanding the disciples to get into the boat and then ending with Jesus making sure they're all still in the boat, worshipping him as ecclesia, as one, his church. Now, I'm very aware that there has been a lot of movement between churches, at least in my area in Woodley, lately. I've met some people who used to attend Anglican churches but no longer feel they can. They've had difficult conversations. The waters absolutely have been choppy and stormy, and they felt that they need to step out. And I get it, I really do. For us at St. John's, I know many of us have left because of painful decisions made by previous leaders and vicars, over 10 years ago, or folk who haven't returned since COVID. Whatever the reason, whether justified or not, my heart's desire from reading this passage is to see Jesus lead them, to lead us all back into community so we can worship him together. And of course, it's possible to be a Christian and not go to church. And to those who are housebound, there might not be the option to go. But for those of us who can go, and remember the beginning of a sermon was about making time and space to meet, it's so important that we do not give up meeting together, that we endure the storms of this life together, whether physical, doctrinal, theological, whatever they are, because Jesus' final prayer, if you remember, was one of unity, that we would be one as he and the Father are one. Amen.